Industry leaders from state-owned enterprises and private enterprises are concerned about the level of vandalism and theft of infrastructure, with the Police Minister Bheki Cele saying hotspots have been identified to avoid further economic sabotage. Joining us to discuss this further is Professor William Gumede, Executive Chairperson of Democracy Works Foundation. Thank you very much for availing yourself this afternoon. Not only are we dealing with vandalism, but we've got long-standing issues of infrastructure decay. It's very easy to see how that then impacts us because it touches each and every single one of us as South Africans. Knowing that, though, is it too late? Are we too far gone as a country, or we are able to turn the tide?
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very grateful. Yes, things has gone down terribly. I mean, what we now see is that the lack of maintenance, lack of investment in infrastructure, and then the breakdown of the rule of law, where people have destroyed our public infrastructure without any police action, and then also our tender system, where companies are supposed to maintain the assets or run our public infrastructure. So companies get contracts, they don't have the capacity and don't even care about maintaining our infrastructure. It is all now snowballed into the breakdown of the whole system of infrastructure in the country. And that, of course, is bad for us in all sorts of ways. Firstly, just for our farmers, our producers, our companies that export things to other countries. They can't do that, and they become uncompetitive compared to other countries. And then that increase, obviously, price, inflation, and transport costs again, and so on. But just passengers, just think about it. I mean, in the 1970s and 1980s, when I grew up and we used trains in the townships, that train system is now almost totally collapsed, whether it's in Durban, whether it's in Cape Town, at Port Elizabeth, and up here in Joburg. And that again increases the costs, for ordinary citizens. So we are really in a very difficult situation infrastructure-wise.
Much is said about exceptional South Africa, but also there's another argument, right, that this is fast becoming, if it's not already, rather, a derailed African state, especially when you take a look at the infrastructure. So what is the risk if things do not turn around for South Africa?
When we compare to other African countries after colonialism, and one of the things that happened and which kind of accelerated many of these countries to the failed stage has been with the public infrastructure. So very few African countries were able, after independence, to build on the infrastructure they inherited. So what happened with the infrastructure for many African countries? It actually collapsed because of lack of maintenance and then lack of rule of law. And corruption, and of course, and the kind of tendering that goes to friends and families and not to competent people. It actually that's the failing of the public infrastructure, one could argue, accelerated the decline of the economies. And also the decline of those countries into failed states, because you have most African countries, and I say most African countries because that's the case, have almost no rail system now. And those who have rail systems, it's barely functioning. And those rail systems were built, during the colonial period, even the 1800s, sometimes, or in the early 1900s. And so on, and that really makes it very difficult to build any economy, because infrastructure is actually at the heart of building economies. So countries that moves from poverty, like in South Korea or Taiwan or Singapore, they build it on infrastructure. So, but in our case, our infrastructure is declining; it's getting worse, and that is also why our economy has been declining and getting worse since 1994.
Prof. Gumede, what then is the recommendation?
I mean, a very, very obvious recommendation, of course, is a public-private partnership in order to restore our public infrastructure. I mean, the advantage that we have, and I don't know how long this advantage is going to last, is that we've got a really strong private sector and a very strong private sector, even in the infrastructure space. So what has now happened, so just an example, let's just, farmers are struggling now. They can't get their products out of the country because the ports have essentially collapsed, the rail has collapsed, and delays. So they face competition with Australia, with Chile, Brazil, who don't have that extra cost of poor infrastructure. So what we could do then is to get, the farmers in a public-private partnership with the state to perhaps take over rail, for example, or a port that's not used, and so on. So we have to think about that now. Then what we need to do is also bring in civil society organizations, and now also to help in the rebuild of the infrastructure. I mean, I remember in the 1980s, for example, there was a lot of rail consumer organizations, where, people who use the rail got together and play an oversight over the functioning, of the trains, ensure that trains are actually on time, and also that there's no vandalization of infrastructure. So, so what we must see, say, for example, on the rail in Soweto, communities who use the rail must get together and form associations, civil society associations, and almost police the rail assets, because these are state-owned rail assets, and also hold the states accountable, the public entities like PRASA and Transnet, for trains to come on time, to be clean, to be safe, and so on. So it's going to have to be a public-private civil society collaboration to make it possible.
Prof, I do wonder whether this is misplaced or not. You'll guide me. But what role then, or what has your observation been of China plugging into the continent, especially when it comes to the massive infrastructure projects that they have had, building road and rail networks?
I mean, and I guess that most probably is a heartbreaking issue, but it's also a positive issue at the same time, because, they're coming in, China's come in because there's no infrastructure in Africa, and because the infrastructure has collapsed, and they build the infrastructure. And of course, they don't build the infrastructure for free. Nothing is for free in this world. Other countries come help another country for free. What they do is they obviously, in return, if the countries can't pay, they take resources, or land, or they barter something which is of use up to them. Or like in Zimbabwe, what they did is they asked for their Chinese workers to come to Zimbabwe, and not to be governed by the local labor dispensation and things like that, and so on. And actually, the lack of infrastructure in Africa is actually an opportunity for South Africa, because we've got private companies, infrastructure companies, we've got state infrastructure companies. So again, the South African public and private infrastructure companies must actually collaborate to build the infrastructure in Africa. That's going to be very important, because not only will it create jobs at home, but it will also create jobs in other African countries, and will also bring us goodwill in other African countries. And it will also be part of, rebuilding Africa, while South Africans make money, create jobs, and other countries get an infrastructure and they grow, and so on. So there's kind of win-win solutions. And that is also, I guess, the failure of our foreign policy. Foreign policy has been criticized. It's just astonishingly bad, because modern foreign policy is things like that, where the state and the private sector also collaborate outside South Africa or outside the country to also bring about economic growth in South Africa and outside South Africa. So again, I mean, our competitive advantage is really still an opportunity. We're not totally down and out as a country. If we can only bring together the public and the private sector, and the public-private sector, civil society, to collaborate, to co-partner, to tackle our infrastructure collapse.
Prof, you sound like a believer in the African Continental Free Trade Area Act, but how do we do that when we can't even move people, let alone, never mind the whole continent, just SADC?
No, absolutely. Obviously, it's difficult, but I mean, unfortunately, the sort of free trade, Africa free trade and African integration has been focused more on theory and on sort of political slogans and statements. Now, unfortunately, no integration ever in the world. And I, did a 5-year project at WITS that we did it with a collaboration of about 6, 7 universities around the world, where we looked at integration and what makes a regional integration successful. First, it has to be built on actual projects. It can't just be built on political slogans and theory and ideologies and so on. So that is the missing thing. So that's what I'm saying. Infrastructure is actually a great opportunity to build the Africa of our dreams and the Africa of the future, but we then have to build it in collaboration, public, private sector, civil society together. If we're only going to say the state or even only going to say China, we're not going to get the integration and so on. So in collaboration builds the kind of societies that we want to build in South Africa, of course, growing wealthy societies and also in Africa. Now, obviously, the reason why things are not working is slogan-based delivery cannot work. It has to be practical projects in collaboration with everyone else, not just with the state or with one governing party, and so on, which obviously has been the case now across Africa. And that is why we are struggling with integration, with regional African integration.
The curious case of Africa. Thank you very much for availing yourself this afternoon. Professor William Gumede, Executive Chairperson of Democracy Works Foundation.